mattered, that fairness mattered, that the smallest voice deserved the same protection as a princess on a warship, and the nobles stiffened at his casual mention of a princess, because their people guarded their royal lineage fiercely, and his words hinted at knowledge he shouldn't possess. But the soldier didn't elaborate, instead stepping slightly to the side to keep Mira behind him while still facing all three nobles. His demeanor calm yet resolute, the kind of strength that didn't need to. Posture. Mira clutched her apron, her fingers trembling with a strange mixture of fear and awe, because she could see in his eyes the reflection of a man who had walked through fire, through battles that burned themselves into the bones, through losses that carved quiet hollows in the heart, and yet he stood here defending her. A simple waitress he'd never spoken to before, and something in her chest opened, soft and aching, a fragile warmth she hadn't felt in years, a feeling that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The nobles exchanged glances, their irritation turning to calculation, realizing finally that this human wasn't going to be intimidated, and the youngest noble, desperate to regain control of the moment, snapped his fingers to summon station security, forgetting for a moment that security was obligated to respond to incidents rather than nobility's ego, and the soldier didn't move, didn't flinch, simply continued breathing with a steady rhythm that somehow filled the tavern more than the neon lights or drifting steam. A soft chime echoed from the door as two station guards entered, armored in polished plates that reflected every shadow, and they halted halfway through the room as they took in the scene, their gazes flicking between the trembling waitress, the three richly dressed aliens, and the lone human standing before them like a line drawn against injustice. And one guard's posture shifted subtly, almost respectfully, when he recognized the soldier, though he said nothing, keeping his face unreadable. The first noble demanded the guards arrest the human for interfering with Nabiri nobility, and the guards hesitated, exchanging a look that held a silent question, because they knew the law, and they knew what the nobles were attempting, and while their orders forced them to maintain neutrality, they also feared the quiet power radiating from the human, a power that whispered of classified reports and old missions whispered about in training halls, missions that carried rumors of a soldier, whose actions bent the trajectory of wars. The soldier didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, simply explained to the guards that the nobles had refused payment and threatened the waitress, and his tone held no anger, only a truth spoken with clarity, and the guards shifted again, unsure whether to follow protocol or follow caution, and Mira stepped forward timidly, her voice trembling as she confirmed his words, her fear battling with the fragile surge of courage the soldier had ignited in her. And the guards exhaled slowly, understanding the situation wasn't as simple as the nobles wished to pretend. The first noble's skin darkened into deep storm colors, a sign of rising fury in his species, and he leaned closer with a hiss that carried the echo of royal privilege, declaring that the human had just sealed his fate by standing against them. A fate that would be decided by the court itself, and the soldier looked at him with an expression that wasn't fear, wasn't anger, but something older and heavier, as if fate was a language he had learned long ago. He told the noble that fate wasn't written by crowns or courts, and Mira felt the words roll through her like a warm pulse, lifting her chin with quiet defiance, and the nobles, shaken by the soldier's unwavering certainty, stepped back just enough to reveal their uncertainty, and the guards shifted toward a more neutral stance, sensing that the tide of the moment was bending away from nobility's grasp. The soldier placed a gentle hand on Myra's shoulder, guiding her a step farther from danger, and the simple touch carried a kind of silent promise, a shield made not of armor but of will, and something in the air thickened again, a reminder that destiny was shaping itself through these small movements, weaving threads none of them yet understood, because the battle brewing here wasn't about a meal or a bill, it was about something deeper, something the nobles sensed but couldn't name, something the soldier carried quietly like a hidden star, and Mira felt, for the first time in years, that her life had collided with a turning point, and that the man standing in front of her wasn't just rescuing her but shifting the very direction of the path she'd been walking in silence. And somewhere beyond the tavern walls, in the cold expanse of space, a warship drifted closer to the station on silent engines, unaware that its arrival would entangle itself with their unfolding fate, and that this simple confrontation was only the first ripple of a storm waiting to break. The warship's distant hum vibrated through the station walls like a pulse from another world, a low trembling that neither humans nor aliens could ignore, and though the tavern lights continued their warm flicker, An undercurrent of unease swept through the room, brushing across Myra's skin like cold fingertips, drawing her closer to the soldier without meaning to, because something in the air whispered that nothing about this night was ordinary. Not the noble's hostility, not the soldiers' calm defiance, not the quiet storm unfolding inside every breath they took. The first noble's eyes shifted toward the ceiling as though he sensed the worship too, his skin darkening with tension, a tone Mira had never seen in their kind, and he muttered something sharp in his native tongue, earning stiff nods from the other nobles, and for the first time since the confrontation began, their arrogance wavered, replaced by a flicker of controlled panic, and Mira realized they weren't afraid of the human alone, but of something larger, something looming beyond the walls, something connected to their court in ways hidden from common knowledge. The soldier remained still, though Mira noticed his breath deepen, just slightly, as though he too recognized the distant resonance, and his gaze lifted toward the tavern's narrow skylight where only darkness lay beyond. Yet his eyes softened with a heaviness that suggested memories stirred inside him, memories woven from worship corridors, emergency sirens, and the weight of responsibility that never fully left his shoulders, and she wondered what he saw in that darkness that made his jaw tighten with such quiet sorrow. The guards exchanged a glance, subtle but clear, because the warship's presence meant someone important was arriving, someone whose rank overshadowed the nobles and threatened to complicate the scene further, and the younger noble, suddenly nervous, hissed at the guards to remove the human immediately, his voice cracking like brittle glass. But the guards didn't move, their hesitation deepening as the tension in the air coiled tighter, twisting around them like invisible thread. The soldier stepped forward just a little, not enough to provoke, but enough to protect Mira from the noble's growing agitation, and his presence felt like a shield unfolding silently, not through violence but through unwavering will, and Myra's heart throbbed with a strange mixture of fear and comfort as she watched him, because she could see the battle inside him, a familiar war between restraint and instinct, between peace and the part of him shaped for conflict, and she wished she knew what pain lived behind his steady expression, what losses carved the quiet in his eyes. The first noble addressed him again, but now his voice shook beneath its polished surface, demanding to know who he really was, what authority he claimed, why he stood against them with such certainty. And the soldier didn't answer, not out of defiance but out of something quieter, as though he believed names meant little in moments where truth spoke louder than rank, and the noble's frustration grew, twisting his features into something brittle and unsteady. A sudden shimmer rippled across the tavern windows as the warship's docking clamps locked into place, and the lights flickered under the vibration, sending a hush through the room as every customer froze, because only vessels of royalty or high command carried that kind of gravitas, and Mira felt her chest tighten, sensing destiny's hand tightening its grip around them, drawing everything into a single thread of fate neither she nor the soldier could step away from now. The youngest noble's voice crumbled into fear as he whispered to the others that the princess must be aboard, that she must not see them humiliated in a human tavern, and Myra's breath caught, because she hadn't known the nobles had ties to royalty, hadn't understood that the simple act of refusing to pay wasn't an act of greed alone but of political carelessness that could ruin them, and she watched as the nobles suddenly straightened their garments, corrected their posture, and glanced nervously toward the door. But the soldier didn't shift, didn't prepare, didn't adjust his stance as if to impress royalty. Instead, he exhaled slowly, a deep, quiet breath that trembled with something Mira almost mistook for grief, and she wondered why a human soldier would react with sorrow at the mention of an alien princess. Unless, perhaps, their histories crossed in ways unknown, ways that etched pain into him deeper than scars. The guard stepped aside instinctively as the tavern doors slid open, and a gust of cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of starship metals and royal sealant oils, and a figure entered robed in deep silver with intricate patterns of light that flowed like water across the fabric, and the nobles bowed instantly, trembling, but Mira couldn't move, rooted in place by the presence that filled the room like a sudden flame in darkness. The robed figure lifted her hood, revealing eyes luminous with shifting blue and gold, eyes carrying the weight of lineage and the loneliness of royalty, and her gaze swept across the tavern before landing on the human soldier, and everything in her expression changed, her breath hitching, her composure cracking gently like frost under warm hands, and Mira felt her pulse race as she sensed the unspoken history between them. The princess whispered his name, a name Mira had not yet learned, spoken with a kind of reverence that softened the air itself, and the nobles stiffened in horror as they realized the man they had mocked, threatened, and tried to punish was not just a soldier but someone intertwined with the highest threads of their destiny. Someone feared and honored in equal measure across their systems, someone whose influence reached further than any of them could grasp. The soldier didn't bow, didn't kneel, didn't perform the expected rituals of respect. Instead, he looked at the princess with a quiet ache that Mira felt in her own chest. A longing carved from years of silence, shared wounds, or promises broken by war and circumstance, and the princess stepped closer, her voice trembling as she asked why he stood here, why he intervened, why he always placed himself where danger met innocence, and he gave no answer, offering only the truth in his eyes, a truth that spoke of who he was even when he spoke nothing at all. The nobles dropped to their knees, begging the princess to forgive their actions, insisting the human provoked them, weaving lies through trembling breaths, but she silenced them with a single gesture, her gaze still fixed on the soldier as if the rest of the room had faded away, and there was something fragile between them. Something Mira didn't understand but felt deeply, like standing too close to a heartbeat that wasn't hers. The princess finally turned to Mira, her expression softening as she realized who had been wronged, and she bowed her head in apology. A gesture so rare among her people it drew gasps from the nobles, and Mira felt tears gather in her eyes, not just from gratitude but from the growing weight of mystery pressing around her, because everything pointed to one truth she hadn't been ready to consider. The soldier wasn't simply brave or strong or principled. He was part of something vast, tangled with alien royalty, warship histories, law and destiny, rescue and fate. And whatever story had begun tonight, Mira was already woven into it, unable to step back, unable to pretend life would return to how it was before one human stood for her with everything he had. The tavern trembled again as the warship above them began powering down its engines, sending a deep rolling vibration through the floor. A reminder that they were no longer just witnesses to a small dispute but participants in a moment the universe itself seemed to be leaning toward. And Mira felt her breath hitch as the princess stood before the human soldier with a gaze that held galaxies of emotion, sorrow, longing, anger, and something more fragile, something Mira couldn't yet name but felt, echoing in her own chest like a second heartbeat. The nobles trembled behind her, kneeling not out of respect but out of fear, their jeweled garments quivering with every nervous breath, and they dared not look up as the princess's attention remained locked on the soldier who still hadn't spoken her name aloud, though Mira saw it forming silently in his eyes, a name carried with the weight of a memory he'd never escaped. When the princess finally broke the silence, her voice wavered like a star on the edge of collapse, asking him why he had returned after vanishing from their world, why he had walked away from the alliance they had bled to build together, and the nobles exchanged horrified glances because they realized this wasn't a soldier with a past. This was a man whose name lived in royal archives, whispered in war rooms, spoken with reverence by soldiers who owed their survival to him. But the soldier only lowered his gaze, the first sign of fragility Mira had seen in him, as if the princess's questions peeled open an old wound he had buried under years of silence, and he told her he hadn't returned for politics or treaties or the scars of old battles. He had simply walked into a tavern and saw someone innocent being hurt, and he couldn't turn away again, not after everything he'd already lost trying to protect people he failed to save. Mira felt a sting of empathy so strong it almost buckled her knees, because she understood now that the soldier's strength wasn't born from power but from sorrow, a sorrow thick enough to drown in, yet he carried it with a grace that humbled everyone who stood near him, even royalty. The princess reached out as if to touch his face but hesitated, her hands suspended in the air, trembling with the memory of a bond formed long ago, a bond fate had cut before either of them were ready, and Mira watched as the soldier gently stepped back, not rejecting her but protecting her from whatever pain clung to him like a shadow that refused to fade. The nobles, desperate to shift the attention away from their misconduct, began stammering excuses about station law, claiming the human had assaulted them, twisting the story into a spiral of lies. But the princess's expression hardened, and she turned toward them with a wrath so cold the air itself seemed to drop in temperature, her luminous eyes narrowing as she demanded the truth from them, and they wilted under her gaze like candles under a storm wind. Yet before they could speak, The tavern's comm screen flickered to life with a priority alert, displaying the seal of the Nabiri royal fleet, and a holographic officer appeared, bowing deeply as he announced that an urgent matter required the princess's immediate attention. A matter concerning a classified message intercepted near the warship. The princess's posture straightened with sudden alarm, and the officer hesitated before revealing that the message carried a signature the royal archives had marked as impossible. A signature belonging to a threat wiped out years ago. A threat the princess and the soldier had faced together during the war. A threat that should never have resurfaced. The soldier's breath hitched, the smallest break in his calm, and Mira saw fear flicker through his eyes like a dying star reigniting. And when the princess whispered the name written in the message, the tavern seemed to freeze, because even the guards paled at the sound of it. A name that carried memories of cities burning, warships falling, soldiers disappearing into silence. A name associated with the massacre that had ended the soldier's military career and shattered the alliance he and the princess once fought to protect. The name was Redefine, the alien warlord believed dead, the architect of the betrayal that had cost the soldier 50 lives he couldn't save, including someone he had loved, someone whose memory still haunted him in dreams he never spoke of. And the princess whispered that Redefine had returned, and the soldier closed his eyes as if bracing against a pain sharper than plasma fire. The nobles gasped, understanding now that their petty cruelty in the tavern had collided with forces far beyond them. And Mira felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones as the princess stepped closer to the soldier, telling him he didn't have to face this alone again. Not this time, not after everything. But he shook his head slowly, a sadness blooming across his features like a fracture in ancient stone. He told her he wasn't here to reopen old wars or fulfill old prophecies. He was here by accident, by coincidence, by fate's inconvenient hand. But the princess whispered that fate didn't make mistakes with him. Never had, and Mira watched, captivated and aching, as the two souls stood on opposite sides of a shared wound, pulled together by a grief they didn't dare name. Then the twist snapped into place, sudden and shattering, as the comm screen flickered again and revealed the full decoded message, showing not just the signature of Redefine but the coordinates attached to it. Coordinates that matched the station they were standing in, and the holographic officer added in a hollow voice that the message carried one more line. A line that froze the soldier's lungs and made the princess cover her mouth in horror. The message read, "I am coming for what was once mine, and for the human who stole everything from me." And then a final signature pulse revealed the impossible truth. The truth the soldier had never shared with anyone. Redefine was not just alive. He had been searching for the soldier for 15 years. Because the soldier was the one who had killed his heir. A secret buried so deeply it could reignite an interstellar war if spoken aloud. And Mira, standing inches behind him, realized she was now tangled in a destiny far bigger and far darker than anything she had ever known. And the soldier finally opened his eyes, the calm gone, replaced by a quiet, terrifying resolve. As he whispered that the past had found him, and fate was demanding its due, the tavern fell into a silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had thickened, pressing against lungs, against ribs, against the fragile certainty everyone carried into this night. And Mira felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the soldier stared at the decoded message, his expression shifting into something hollow and devastating, something that whispered of a past torn open too violently to ever be closed again. And the princess, trembling, looked as though a star had died behind her eyes. The nobles, once arrogant, now knelt in terrified stillness, their jeweled robes dimming under the weight of what they just witnessed, knowing suddenly that their petty cruelty earlier had placed them in the crosshairs of a force older and darker than political privilege. A force that slaughtered planetary fleets and erased cities in a single night. And the guards stepped backward instinctively, sensing danger that didn't belong inside any station walls. The holographic officer swallowed hard before continuing, explaining that Redefine's signature wasn't drifting aimlessly through space but approaching with precision, carried by a warship so massive it dwarfed anything in the Nabiri royal fleet. A vessel long believed destroyed in the war, a vessel known in whispers as the Grave Star, and Mira felt her knees weaken as she realized the galaxy had built its peace on an illusion, on the mistaken belief that their worst enemy had died. But instead, he had been rebuilding in the shadows, waiting for the moment his vengeance could unravel everything. The princess turned to the soldier, her voice cracking as she said his name again, pleading for him to speak, to look at her, to let her help, but he kept his gaze fixed on the hologram, his breath slow and sharp, as though each inhale burned him from the inside, and Mira saw in his eyes the flicker of a soul who had fought too many battles and carried too many ghosts, and she understood that this moment was not just about revenge or justice, but about a reckoning he had run from for 15 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, scraping against old wounds, as he admitted the truth he had hidden even from those he had once trusted, that he had killed Rethvas's heir not out of malice but to save 50 innocent lives. Children, refugees, diplomats, civilians, and though the galaxy had hailed him as a silent guardian for that mission, the classified reports never revealed that the heir had been taken hostage by Voss and forced to fire upon the civilians, a trap engineered to break the soldier's spirit completely, and when he fired back, ending the heir's life, he shattered Voss in a way that reshaped the entire war. Mira felt the room sway as the soldier confessed that he never spoke of it because the cost of victory had carved something unforgivable inside him, a guilt that infected every breath, every night, every attempt to live a life outside war, and the princess stepped towards him, tears trembling at the edge of her luminous eyes, whispering that he had saved those children, that he had saved her, that he had saved more lives than any soldier in the Alliance. But he only shook his head, unable to accept redemption when the shadow of the past had returned to claim its due. The tavern trembled with a second deep vibration, stronger than before, as an external alarm blared through the station corridors, and the comm screen switched automatically to emergency mode, revealing the impossible. A dark silhouette emerging from hyperspace. A fortress-sized warship shaped like a jagged wound carved into the cosmos, surrounded by a haze of drifting metal shards that glimmered faintly with captured starlight, and the name pulsed beneath the image in blood-red lettering. Gravestar, commanded by Rethvas. Panic erupted across the station as corridors filled with terrified civilians racing toward evacuation pods, and the guards immediately took defensive stances while the nobles collapsed into deeper bows, begging for protection. But the princess barely heard them, her gaze locked on the soldier as she whispered that if Voss had come for him specifically, the consequences would reach beyond personal vengeance, because the murder of a royal heir, even a corrupted one, could be used as justification to reignite the war that had once torn half the sector apart, a war their new alliance was far too fragile to survive. The soldier finally turned to her, sorrow rippling through him like a wave crashing against a shore, and he told her the truth he had held in silence for years, that the last day he stood by her side, during the negotiation of the ceasefire, he realized that his existence had become a burden too heavy for her political future, that being tied to a soldier haunted by classified sins would paint her as weak, and so he vanished to protect her path, not knowing fate would twist that choice into betrayal in her eyes. The princess stepped closer with trembling hands, whispering that she never wanted protection from him. She wanted partnership, wanted truth, wanted him to stay, and Mira felt the heartbreak vibrating between them, a wound reopened by the arrival of an enemy who had shaped both their destinies. And for a moment the galaxy seemed to pause, suspended between reconciliation and annihilation. Then the comm system erupted with a new message, the voice unmistakably Rethvas's, deep, cold, and dripping, with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting far too long to deliver a final blow, declaring that he would not fire upon the station immediately, because he wanted the soldier to come to him willingly, wanted to face him without interference, wanted the galaxy to watch the fall of the man who had ended his bloodline, and he promised that if the soldier refused, the Gravestar would open fire on the civilian docks first, killing thousands within seconds. Mira gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, while the nobles fainted from terror, and the princess shouted that Voss had no right. But her voice trembled as she recognized the trap, for if the soldier accepted the duel, he would die, and if he refused, the galaxy would burn. The soldier closed his eyes slowly, exhaling a breath that sounded like surrender and resolve bound into one. And Mira felt her heart crush inside her chest as he whispered that he would go, because he could not watch innocent blood spill again because of him, because this fate had always been waiting, because some lives existed not to escape the past but to end it. But then the twist twisted again, deeper, darker, and more devastating. The princess stepped forward and declared that she was going with him, not as a ruler, not as a symbol, but as someone whose destiny had been tied to his since the war they fought together. And Mira saw the shock on the soldier's face as she added that the Galactic Council had just activated an ancient clause. A clause that stated if the princess died in an unauthorized conflict, the alliance would collapse instantly, igniting a civil war across 5 systems. And in that crushing moment, Mira understood the terrible truth. The soldier was walking into death to save millions. But if the princess followed, the entire galaxy would fall anyway. And destiny, in its cruel symmetry, had placed the fate of worlds into the trembling hands of a soldier who already carried too much, and a princess whose love for him could doom them all. And as alarms blared and evacuation sirens wailed, Mira realized her own life had been pulled into the gravity of this conflict, and whatever happened next, none of them would return unchanged, because the galaxy's future now hung on a single impossible choice. And the soldier, with a final haunted breath, whispered that sometimes fate didn't offer choices at all, only sacrifices. The station sirens wailed like dying stars, their echoes vibrating through the metal bones of the structure as if warning every living soul that destiny had shifted, that a storm older than memory was descending upon them. And Mira felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs as the soldier stood frozen in the center of the tavern, torn between impossible choices, his silence louder than the alarms, louder than the panic rising in every corridor, louder even than the distant hum of the grave star. As it drifted into full view against the station's windows, the princess stepped closer, her silver robes trembling in the artificial wind as emergency shutters cycled open and shut, her luminous eyes softening with a kind of tenderness carved from grief and devotion. And she whispered that she wouldn't let him face Rethvas alone, not after everything they had survived, not after everything she had lost when he disappeared from her life without a single word. Yet her voice cracked under the weight of the truth she already knew, that going with him meant the unraveling of 5 systems, the collapse of peace, the reignition of a war that could murder billions. The soldier closed his eyes as if trying to breathe through a lifetime's worth of regret, and Mira saw his throat tighten as he whispered her title not with formality but with aching familiarity. A single word soaked in longing and apology, and the princess gasped as though the sound of her own name spoken by him awakened wounds she had tried to numb for years, wounds that had never healed, wounds he had never meant to create. He told her he could not let her follow him this time, that he had already destroyed too much simply by existing, that if she came near the battle he faced, the galaxy itself would ignite. And she shook her head desperately, tears gathering at the corners of her golden blue eyes as she asked if he had ever considered that maybe her life, her choices, were hers, not something for him to guard from afar, not something for him to walk away from in the name of protection that tasted too much like abandonment. Mira felt her own chest tighten painfully as she watched the 2 souls stitched together by war and hope and heartbreak standing on the brink of destruction, tangled in a love that had never been allowed to exist openly, a bond that duty had crushed and silence had strangled, a bond now being ripped wider by the arrival of Rethvas and the terrible legacy he carried. But even as the princess reached for him, the soldier stepped back, the soft glow of emergency lights casting his shadow long and hollow across the tavern floor, and he whispered that if she died, if her life ended in the shadow of Vas's vengeance, the galaxy would fracture beyond repair, because her political alliances held together systems that despised each other, because her diplomacy had saved worlds he could never reach, because she was the single thread keeping the fragile peace from collapsing into chaos. Her voice shook as she told him he mattered too, that he always had, that the galaxy owed him its survival, and that she had spent 15 years trying to rebuild something that still felt incomplete without him. But he only looked at her with that quiet, devastating sorrow that said he had already accepted the cost of this moment long before it arrived. Then Mira, unable to bear the crushing silence, stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed them on the soldier's arm, feeling the tension coiled inside him like a storm waiting to break. And she whispered that he didn't have to die, that fate didn't have to choose sacrifice every time, that there must be another way. And the soldier looked at her with surprise softening his eyes, a warm flicker amid the cold storm of duty tearing him apart. But before he could answer, the station shuddered violently as the grave star's gravitational field pressed against the outer hull, bending metal, dimming lights, warping the air until the very oxygen vibrated. And the holographic officer shouted that Vas was demanding a response, demanding the soldier's surrender. demanding the galaxy watch him kneel before the warlord who had burned entire systems for lesser insults. The guards began shouting orders, pushing nobles toward evacuation routes, securing blast doors, preparing for a strike they knew they couldn't survive. Yet the soldier stood still in the center of the chaos, caught between past and future, caught between the princess's trembling plea and the horrifying responsibility waiting for him outside, caught between love and guilt and destiny's cruel arithmetic. The princess reached for him again and whispered that if he faced Voss alone, she would never forgive herself for letting him walk into death without her, and Mira watched his resolve fracture, a pain tearing through him so deep it almost radiated into the air. He stepped forward, cupped the princess's face gently with a hand that had once held weapons heavier than regret, and whispered that he had left her years ago because he thought it would keep her safe. But now fate demanded the same sacrifice again, and he didn't know if he had the strength to walk away a second time. Her tears slipped down her cheeks like falling stars as she pressed her forehead to his, whispering that she loved him, whispering that she always had, whispering that her heart had never belonged to her people but to him, even when duty forced her to pretend otherwise. And Mira felt her breath break, because she knew he wanted to say the same thing, could see the truth trembling on his lips, but he didn't speak it, because love could save worlds or destroy them, and tonight it threatened to destroy galaxies. Then the station lights flickered red as a final message from the grave star arrived. A single line pulsing across the screen like a heartbeat made of fire. You have 5 minutes before the first volley is released. The soldier straightened slowly, the last pieces of hesitation falling away, leaving only the quiet, terrifying resolve of someone walking into the storm with no expectation of returning. And he whispered to the princess that if he succeeded, the galaxy would survive, and if he failed, she must live long enough to rebuild what came after. She begged him not to go, clutching his hand as though she could anchor him to life. But he gently pulled free, turning toward the docking bay, each step heavy with fate. And Mira watched his silhouette walking into danger, feeling the shape of destiny tightening around them all, knowing the climax was rising like a tidal wave no one could outrun. Because the galaxy wasn't just waiting for a battle, it was waiting for a reckoning, and the soldier was walking straight into the heart of it, carrying the weight of worlds on his shoulders, carrying the grief of 15 years, carrying the love he could not speak aloud. And the princess, collapsing to her knees, understood this truth with shattering clarity. The man she loved was going to war alone, and the galaxy might not survive the outcome. The soldier's footsteps echoed down the metal corridor like distant thunder, each step pulled from him not by momentum but by fate's unyielding hand. And Mira and the princess watched from behind the security barrier as the evacuation lights bathed him in a red glow, turning his silhouette into something mythic, something carved from loss and courage in equal measure. And the station shuddered again as the grave star loomed outside the viewing windows like a floating mausoleum built for the living. The princess pressed trembling fingers against the glass, whispering his name with a raw, broken plea that cracked through the alarms. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop, because a warlord's vengeance was seconds from igniting and a galaxy's fragile peace trembled on the edge of collapse. And Mira felt tears burn her eyes as she watched the quiet, steady hero walk toward a destiny he had never asked for, but always carried like a shadow across every breath he took. When he reached the docking platform, the automated umbilical tube extended with a hiss, sealing around the small shuttle he would pilot toward the grave star. A single glowing path that looked more like a thread between life and death than a corridor of steel. And he paused only once, turning back just far enough for Mira and the princess to see his eyes, soft with apology and love and acceptance. And Mira felt her chest tighten as she realized this wasn't simply a man walking toward battle. It was a goodbye, a silent, devastating goodbye carved into the spaces between alarms and heartbeat and breath. The princess broke past the guards with a sudden cry, sprinting toward him, her silver robes flaring behind her like wings made from shattered starlight, and she reached the edge of the barrier as he stepped into the shuttle, her hands slamming against the invisible force field with a choked scream, begging him not to leave her again, not to abandon her to a fate without him, not to carry this burden alone. He pressed his palm to the other side of the barrier, aligning his hand with hers through the shimmering divide, and the moment froze the station, froze Mira, froze the spiraling chaos beyond the walls as though time itself bowed in reverence to the tenderness between them. With a voice trembling like a dying star, he whispered that he loved her. Words he had locked away for 15 years. Words he believed he had no right to speak. Words that now spilled out like a truth that refused to die even when fate demanded it. The princess collapsed to her knees as the shuttle doors sealed, whispering back that she had loved him all along. From the first day he saved her life to the last day he disappeared from it. Through every war, every silence, every dream where she searched for him in the dark, and Mira felt her soul shake at the rawness of their confession. So late, so impossible, so painfully timed by destiny rather than desire, the shuttle broke away from the station like a single tear falling into the void, and outside the viewing windows the grave star opened its jagged hangar, a dark wound awaiting its final guest, and as the distance closed, the soldier breathed slowly, steadying himself for what was to come, feeling the weight of ghosts pressing gently against him, reminding him that every life he had ever saved, every choice he had ever made, had led to this singular moment of reckoning. When the shuttle docked, he stepped into the cavernous interior of the grave star, the air thick with cold vapor that curled around his boots like the whispers of the dead, and the massive doors sealed behind him, leaving him alone in a corridor illuminated only by pulsating red veins of light, each pulse echoing the beating heart of the warlord waiting deeper inside the vessel. Reth Voss appeared at the far end of the war hall, draped in armor forged from obsidian and fractured starlight. His face a map of fury carved by loss, his eyes burning with a hatred so deep it seemed to warp the air around him, and the two men stood across from each other in the chamber where destinies were broken or remade. The warlord's voice thundered through the hall as he accused the soldier of murdering his heir, of destroying his lineage, of shattering his legacy. But the soldier stood calm, his voice soft as he answered that he had fired to save innocent lives, that he mourned the heir too, that no father deserved such pain, but that vengeance built on lies would only create more graves, more ghosts, more worlds destroyed beyond redemption. Voss roared in agony, in denial, in rage, and launched forward with the fury of a dying star collapsing in on itself, and the clash between them shook the grave star from engine core to outer hull. A collision of grief against guilt, vengeance against truth, destiny against mercy, and Mira watched from the station as the lights of the grave star flickered, as the readings spiked, as the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Inside the war hall, the battle tore across metal and memory, each strike dragging both men closer to despair and revelation, until at last the soldier disarmed Voss, pinning him to the fractured floor, his own body shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, and he whispered the truth he had carried alone for 15 years, that he had not killed the heir in hatred but in mercy, because Voss himself had forced the heir into the battlefield as a weapon, trapping the child in an impossible choice, and the soldier had ended his suffering because Voss would not. The truth broke Voss more deeply than any blade could, and the warlord's fury collapsed into a hollow sob, his vengeance dissolving into unbearable grief. And in that moment the grave star's weapons flickered and powered down, as if the vessel itself sensed the shift in its master's soul. But the soldier knew the end was inevitable, knew the battle had awakened the unstable core of the warship, knew the grave star was about to explode, and there was no time to escape. He sent a final transmission to the princess, his voice soft, telling her that the galaxy would live, that peace would endure, that she must carry the flame forward even if he could not stand beside her. And she screamed his name as the grave star ignited in a blinding burst of light that swallowed the void. The station windows glowed with the eruption, a supernova of metal and memory dissolving into stardust, and Mira held the princess as she collapsed, sobbing into Myra's shoulder while the galaxy shifted around them, healing and breaking in the same breath. And as the ashes of the grave star drifted across the cosmos, carried like a final whisper into eternity, the princess lifted her gaze, tears shimmering like nebulae, knowing the universe had just lost the man who saved it. But somewhere deep in her heart, she felt an echo, a warmth, a presence, as if destiny, kind for the first time in their lives, had not taken him fully, as if stories born from sacrifice never truly end, as if love, once spoken aloud, could bend even the stars. And Mira knew, as the princess stood beneath the fading glow, that this was not the end of his legend. It was the beginning of everything he left behind. a legacy written across galaxies, a love carved into fate itself, a human who changed worlds with a single act of courage, and a destiny that would never be forgotten.